Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IESD in University of Lyon 3. We are here today to debate about the announcement of the integrated review by the British government made in March with several strategic surprises. To speak about this review today with us, we have Andrew Dorman, which is a professor in King's College and commissioning editor of the review International Affairs. Matthew Uttley, which is also a full professor at King's College and head of the Defense Studies chair. Joseph Henrotin, a researcher at the Institut of Comparée Strategy and to the CAPRI, a French group of reflection about strategic matters, and Olivier Zajec, associate professor to the University of Lyon 3 and director of the IESD. With no further ado, I let the floor to Olivier Zajec for his introduction to this conference, which will deal with the announcement of the integrated review. And I let you the floor, Mr. Zajec.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, for this short introduction and for this presentation. And thank you very much to our colleagues, to our students, and to our friends at large to have accepted this invitation to join our debate about the consequences and perspectives of this integrated review, very interesting document, especially in the European context, the European strategic context. That is a very interesting perspective for all of us who are interested in defense and strategic matters. Anthony, before to begin with my introduction, would it be possible to activate the sharing
I've made it.
For the PowerPoint.
You can now share your PowerPoint.
Okay, no problem. That's it. It is okay for everyone? Do you okay, copy the presentation. So I will just introduce our debates with this subject, strategic convergence with caveats. So and especially we are here to discuss about the post-Brexit, obviously, Franco-British defense cooperation. It's a very difficult subject. It is not always very clear, especially in France, I must say. And it's interesting for us to have more perspectives on this. So in 2018, first of all, in a RUSI briefing paper, a former UK National Security Advisor, Lord Peter Ricketts, wrote that the Brexit would change the context of the Franco-British relationship. And to him, there was a real risk that the two countries will drift apart irreparably. So we have here the copy of his statement. I quote him, President Macron has made clear that his top international priority is a stronger and more dynamic Franco-German leadership in EU. So to this distinguished national security specialist advisor, I think, I'm not sure, but I think he was really instrumental in preparing the Lancaster House Treaty. He was involved in this process, if I remember well, but I'm not sure. I'm sure that our colleagues could perhaps confirm this. So to him, Britain will have to work harder to maintain its key relationship with France, even in areas extra that lie outside the scope of the EU. So that was in 2018. Now, does the insight we now have from the Brexit, that is very relative insight, admittedly, but does this insight allow us to say that Lord Ricketts' prediction was too pessimistic. In a way, I would say that the recent integrated review that will be discussed this evening gives us the beginning of an answer as far as defense is concerned, but it does not fully address the whole problem. Far from it. In order to consider the question in a forward-looking manner, perhaps it seems to me that three complementary perspectives could be articulated here. The first one is the question of the political and strategic identity of the European Union as a whole, and in particular, its relationship with NATO at a time when American foreign policy is proving perhaps increasingly difficult to predict. The second perspective is the reality, the very reality of the so-called Franco-German strategic relationship or strategic convergence, sorry. Will it last longer than Mr. Macron's presidency? And will it survive the departure of Mrs. Merkel? And last but not least, the third perspective points to the strategic and defense component of global Britain after the Brexit. What exactly are we talking about here? And if I dare, I would even ask, does the British government itself know it precisely? So these three perspectives, I'm sure, will be addressed to varying degrees by Professor Dorman, Professor Uttley, and Joseph Henrotin through a specific prism, industrial, doctrinal, or operational, among others. I would like to thank them once again for offering us their expertise on these difficult issues. For my part, in order to introduce this evening's problematics and to leave as much time as possible to our guests, I will limit my presentation by asking just a few questions about the state of the relationship between the two main actors of defense in Europe. And it is not really useful to present them. The fundamental point that I think it is important to stress is the existence of what I would call a real paradox in the strategic and defense relationship between the United Kingdom and France. This paradox is based on the tension between two dimensions that are very difficult to articulate. The first one is positive and centripetal in nature. It favors rapprochement in terms of defense policy between Paris and London. France and the United Kingdom share the same strategic identity, that of middle powers with global ambitions. Taken together, those nations, you know this perfectly, invest nearly 40% of the defense budget of European allies and more than 50% of the European spending on research and technology. Their two armies have the same expeditionary culture, and their conventional military apparatus is relatively comparable in terms of numbers and technological level. The creation of the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force demonstrates, I think, that the benefits that both countries derive from this operational proximity is real. And despite some capability shortcomings derived from the COIN era, the Iraq-Afghan era, in a way, United Kingdom is the only European country with which France is able to conduct high-intensity operations, such as, for example, I would say Operation Hamilton in 2018. Germany, like the other European players, lives in another world from this point of view. So let's provide just one element of atmosphere among others. In 2020, so last year, 56 French military liaison personnel are integrated into British staffs and 54 British into French staffs. Between France and Germany, these numbers do not exceed, in fact, 30 on either side. So finally, and this point is perhaps the most important, Paris and London remain the only two military atomic powers in Western Europe and are cooperating more and more on this subject, as shown by the existence of the tête-à-tête program. So one could also say that, as some researchers do, that this nuclear cooperation explains why Lancaster House in 2010 took the form of a treaty and not a simple agreement. That's for nuclear in a way. That's at the center of this relationship. And it should be recalled sometimes that this nuclear cooperation, which is very curiously little talked about in the public debate in France, is binding for half a century. It is legally binding for half a century. So it therefore escapes the effects of Brexit. In addition to this, there are many industrial cooperations, but I will let my colleagues perhaps specify this more than and better than I could do. So that was the first aspect of the bilateral relation, so to say, the positive one. Now, despite such an operational and technological rapprochement, this functionally centripetal dimension is counterbalanced by a second politically centrifugal dimension. And here, let me quote the preamble of the Lancaster House Treaty of November 2010. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the French Republic, hereinafter referred to as the parties, and so on, recalling that their foreign and defense policies are founded on common interests, values, and responsibilities, etc., etc. The interpretation of this preamble poses a problem that can be applied more generally to London's relationships with the European Union. As far as values and responsibilities are concerned, it is certain that points of view have no difficulty in converging. But as far as interests are concerned, however, I would say that it is possible to consider that Lancaster House does not correspond fully to reality, or at least that the French and the English do not have the same definition of this word. In theory, one could simplify things by saying that a strategy is defined according to interests, which are themselves defined according to an identity. Identity, interests, strategy. This equation works very well for each individual country. But as soon as the European factor is introduced, the same equation produces different results for each country. So it is a fact. Paris and London have a quite opposed vision of Europe's political destiny. And this is not new, okay? After all, it would be possible to consider that the British vote of June 2016 had nothing to do with a rupture and everything with a clarification. It only translates legally what has existed politically since 1973, a permanent internal opposition from London to any attempt by the European Union to become anything other than a prosperous free trade zone. I'm a little bit hard on this in order to try to use, some critics towards the British strategy that we can find out especially in the French debate. But to be fair, it should be noted that in the NATO field, Paris' position on this question of Europe's political identity is comparable to that of London in the EU. France sees NATO as a very interesting forum for interoperability and military cooperation. On the other hand, the political autonomy of the organization is judged by the French with much more mistrust. No summary is clearer on this point than that of, the former French Foreign Ministry, Hubert Védrine, offered in 2012 of a report to the President of the Republic on relations between France and NATO. I quote him here on the slide, and I hope that you all can view this slide. You can read it with me. NATO will remain an alliance around the world's leading military power, the United States, but we share fundamental values. Now, this word of values, again, really, really interesting, but whose orientations and policies may vary considerably all 2 or 4 years. That was before the election of Donald Trump. And it is for sure that the dimension of this statement is perhaps reinforced by this Trump experience. So in order to conclude this introduction, should we consider that such a judgment by this French Foreign Ministry shows or proves the unsurpassable nature of the paradox that I have just mentioned? Even if they can cooperate from an instrumental point of view, are the strategic visions of France and the United Kingdom definitely incompatible as soon as the strategic destiny of Europe is concerned? I'm sure that our colleagues will provide more precise and enlightening answers to this question that I could. As I hand over to them, I would simply like to open a last perspective by rereading with you a British strategic policy document that was published before the Brexit became effective, and which, to me, summed up London's strategic vision quite well. We can perhaps read it together because it determines the exercise of our sovereignty and our freedom of action, etc. The United Kingdom must retain its ability to decide and act alone to defend its interests. The United Kingdom's ability to continue to wait and act is an asset to support and unite the will of its neighbors, etc., etc. Very interesting, very, in a way, representative, isn't it? But hey, wait a minute. I'm sorry, but this version is a fake. The real text is actually part of the French Defense and National Strategic Review, published in 2017. Here comes the real transcript. We have only to change one word, and it's the same statement in the same text. I apologize for this, but in a way, there was perhaps funny manner to suggest something very serious, that when it comes to strategic relations, and in spite of their competing visions about what the European Union should be politically, I think that Paris and London future options are perhaps not as strategically divergent as they seem to be at the first look. And also that, in spite of the current Franco-German rapprochement, the prediction of Lord Ricketts can be considered or could be considered as too pessimistic. As a recent paper stated, it could be and should be a strategic convergence with caveats between Paris and London. But considering the actual state of the international system and the European strategic neighboring, it's better than drifting apart. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's now my pleasure to let the floor to my colleague, Professor Dorman, for the first really specialized intervention on our topic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. Anthony, can I ask you to put my presentation up, or do you want me to do it?
As you wish. I can.
Can I let you do it?
Yeah, of course I can.
That's very kind of you, because when I get involved in technology, it invariably breaks. So it's always safer to have other people doing the technology than to have me doing the technology. Can I thank you very much for the invitation you've extended to me and to Matthew, and we're really delighted to be here, virtually with you. And thank you very much for that first presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it really posed some really interesting questions and some really challenges in terms of what the integrated review is about. And it's worth bearing in mind, as our first speaker talked about Lord Ricketts. Lord Peter Ricketts was the Britain's first national security advisor. He served as national security advisor from 2010 to 2012. So it's put through the first big defence review of what was then a coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And then after 2 years of having served as national security advisor, he was the UK ambassador to France from 2012 to 2016 before retiring and becoming a member of the House of Lords. So very much involved in the whole Lancaster House as national security advisor, and then very much involved as British ambassador to France in the developments that we saw subsequent to that, and very much encourage and push forward the directions of greater UK French consulting, working together. You also mentioned in that first presentation, global Britain. And I think it's interesting because so much of what we talk about and has been spoken about, particularly from the likes of the British establishment of Boris Johnson, of Dominic Raab, the current British Foreign Secretary, it talks about global Britain. And it's worth bearing in mind where global Britain came from. As a term, it came out of Theresa May, Boris's predecessor as Prime Minister, when she got appointed after David Cameron, having lost lost the Brexit vote, stepped down, and after a number of candidates put themselves forward, ultimately Theresa May became the next Prime Minister. And in her first speech to the Conservative Party conference, she used the phrase global Britain to say what British foreign and defence and security policy should be or would be after Brexit. It would be a global Britain, to try and emphasise a positive nature about where Brexit would be and where it would go and how it would reinvigorate Britain's place in the world, whatever that meant. Boris was her first Foreign Secretary, having heard the speech 4 days later, picked up that same phrase and has constantly repeated it about it's going to be good for Britain, a global Britain, Britain in the world. But there's been very little substance or actually understanding of what global Britain meant. So if I could have the next slide, please. Until now, with the integrated review, actually I think most commentators would now, or analysts would say, the disintegrated review. Because when you look at the integrated review, it's a series of 3 documents. So we had the integrated review, which was in a sense a new national security strategy published in 1 week. Just over a week later, we had the Defence Command paper, which was supposed to be Defence's side of the integrated review, what it meant for the British Armed Forces and so forth, how they would posture themselves, how they would configure themselves, what types of equipment they would emphasise and so forth. And then the day after that, we had the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy, how this would affect industry, how it would affect Britain's relationships with its defence industrial base, in terms of defence exports and so forth. And what was really interesting, that most analysts had dismissed the integrated review before the Defence Command paper came out a week later. In a sense, it had already failed. It had been seen to be a complete and utter failure, which is interesting because what Boris had emphasised when he launched the integrated review was this was going to be the best, the most deepest, most thought-provoking, the most strategically visioned, all these sort of narratives that you would talk about to say, you know, this is going to be the best review we've ever had since the end of the Cold War, better than anything we've had before. And it was interesting that they emphasised it will be the most strategically thought through. This alludes to a debate that we have seen across the British establishment since 2009 about whether there was strategic literacy within government. And in 2009, in a piece written in International Affairs in the March edition called Blair's Wars and Brown's Budgets, it basically said the British state had lost the ability to think strategically. And what we've seen since then with the creation of the National Security Council, appointment of National Security Advisor and so forth, is attempts by the British establishment and successive governments to try and rebuild the ability to think strategically. And one of the arguments we've seen with the new Boris administration and bringing the Department for International Development into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is about this idea that this will be a strategic and thought-provoking and well-articulated, thought-through review. And there's a number of reasons why we can start to think why this will probably, but we'll come back onto those. And it's interesting how it's spun. So when you look at the language and I'm going to focus on the integrated review and the Defence Command paper, is the emphasis on the UK's relationship with the United States. The US is its premier partner, which is probably not surprising when we've had so much literature and talk about a special relationship. But underpinning this is a sense an ongoing tension within the British state about where it fits in the world. Because what the UK we saw in its previous additions to the Great Britain and Northern Ireland, of Great Britain and Ireland, in the 18th, 19th and the first half of the 20th century, is in modern parlance, the UK operated as an offshore balancer. It saw Europe as a way, it would move between alliances, between partnerships, as a way of balancing and stabilising Europe. For the UK, it wanted a peaceful Europe to trade with Europe and a peaceful Europe so it could trade beyond Europe. And one of the reasons, and this links in partly into this global narrative, is that Britain has to trade. One of the problems the UK has had since the early part of the 19th century is it cannot grow enough food to feed itself. It has insufficient raw materials. It therefore has to trade. It therefore has looked through imperialism and so forth to trade. So what we've seen, and it came out in the 1930s by writer Basil Liddell-Hart, talked about the British way in warfare, which is in a sense is Britain as an offshore balancer. And there's elements within this integrated view that start when it's and this idea of this tilt to the Indo-Pacific, of Britain returning to this British way in warfare, of returning to being an offshore balancer. But there are two basic problems with this idea. And the reason Britain stopped being an offshore balancer from 1945 onwards is it could no longer balance Europe. From the late 40s onwards, the fear of the Soviet Union and so forth meant that the UK wanted to tie the United States in as the offshore balancer to deter the Soviet Union and so forth. And as part of that process, it helped construct and build and preserve NATO as the permanent military security alliance. Offshore balancers are transactional. They don't look for permanent alliances. They don't look for permanent partnerships. So what we've got in this integrated review is both the hints of Britain want to be an offshore balancer at the same time as preserving its strategic relationship with the United States and maintaining NATO. And NATO is emphasized as the bedrock of the Britain's alliance system. But it's not the only alliance system, but it's one of the key ones. So you get this throughout the emphasis document about Britain maintaining its role within NATO, maintaining its relationship with the United States, and then this reference to the Indo-Pacific. Well, this is interesting in a number of respects. Firstly, the language of Indo-Pacific is very much the language of the US confronting China. This is part of the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So in using that language, that linguistic reference to it, we start to talk about an element of a confrontational relationship with China, but I'll come back to that. So we've got linguistics about it wanting to be this idea, but return to an offshore balance, whilst at the same time maintaining permanent relationships with NATO, with the United States. We also see within the documents that it articulates, going back to the ideas of emphasizing a threat. And this, in previous national security reviews and defense white papers we've seen for the last decades, they've talked about risk, balancing risk. This one goes back to the idea of threat. And the key threat that's identified is Russia. Russia is the principal threat to the United Kingdom, to Europe, to Western Europe and so forth. And there's elements in here pointing to the attacks in Salisbury using which led to a loss of British life and so forth, that Russia is the principal threat. Yet this yearning to move beyond Europe remains within that. So you've got talk about Russia, and this is important when it comes to what some of the bits are when talking about nuclear weapons. But you've also got that within this an emphasis on China, that China is both potentially a strategic challenger in terms of economic challenger, of potentially a military challenger given its Chinese build-up, concerns about Chinese challenges to the international order, and also see China as a potential partner. And this also goes back to, in a sense, the tension between Britain from 1945 onwards and Britain as an offshore balancer pre-1945. To be honest, and this is clear, I think the first presentation alluded to this, the world that has been created since 1945 of liberal international order and so forth, an increasing emphasis on globalization, has actually really suited the United Kingdom. It has played to its strengths. Like France, it's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's a key allied partner within NATO. It has significant influence within a number of other institutions. It used to be within the European Union, but you see it through other alliances, and Britain's relative position in terms of London as a key financial market in conjunction with New York. Globalization really suited the United Kingdom. It gave it, in a sense, for, let's face it, a relatively small island nation of just 60 to 65 million population, disproportionate influence. As the previous speaker says, so the UK was a world power, not a superpower, but like France, a world power, a power with interest beyond its immediate regions. It wanted to look and has global interests. If we look at, for example, at the maritime insurance market, it is in London. So there's lots of things that draw and continue to emphasize Britain as a global player because it has global interests. And like France, it has a number of, we refer to them as dependent territories throughout the world that remain part of which the United Kingdom retains responsibility in the Indo-Pacific, whether it be, it's got links and responsibilities to things like Pitcairn Islands and so forth, South Pacific, the Falklands. It's got a whole series of dependent territories. It has a close relationship with the five-power defence arrangement with Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia and Singapore. So it has global responsibilities. Globalization has really suited the UK. It has meant that its economy has grown, particularly on the financial sector, quite significantly in the UK, depending on which year you look at and which set of statistics you want to look at, between 5th and 7th of the economic power. But it can't retain that. In a sense, the UK is a stasis power, a power in which it doesn't want the world to change because it has disproportionate influence at the moment. Things suit it, so it doesn't want the game to change. It doesn't want powers to rise, but it knows they will. China's gone past it. India will go past it. Other states will go past it. We know that. So in a sense, the vision for the United Kingdom is relative decline. Its economy will continue to grow, but relative to other nations, others will pass it. And the prediction is a relative decline. So what it wants to do, and this is the very thing that governments have really struggled to articulate, is its vision for the future is to try and delay the future for as long as possible. It wants the world to stay as it is rather than to change. But that's not something a politician can say. You can't say we don't want to change, but decline is going to happen. So Theresa May came up with Global Britain. Boris has come out, taken this phrase of Global Britain here, the idea that the UK would return to some sort of ideal vision of what was the 1950s within the Conservative Party has been put forward. A sort of Shangri-La, because the 1950s weren't that great for a lot of people. There was the recovery from the Second World War, lots of bomb damage and so forth, and devastation that had to be rebuilt. But there was this vision of what the 1950s might have been about. So we have a world which in the UK is starting to do some form of tilt, pivots. Different words have been used toward the Indo-Pacific, acknowledging that as the Indo-Pacific becomes the economic hub of the world economy as opposed to the Atlantic, that the UK needs to focus much more on that because of its global interests and so forth. But it's only a partial tilt. And a bit like the American tilt announced under Obama in 2011, it's also one of the things to emphasize when you look at this language is not to where it tilts to, but where it's tilting from. And if you look at it, and the subtext within that is a degree of withdrawal from the Middle East and Persian Gulf in particular. So whilst let's talk about using the Persian Gulf as a base for to deploy the carrier and so forth, it's actually a move away from that. So one of the things you see with the Royal Marines is the idea of these new strike ships. The first one they're going to play with is to take out the amphibious ship that's currently permanently based in the Gulf, take it out of there, move it to the Indo-Pacific as a way if we configure it and trial it there. So what we're seeing is a UK that's starting to move out of the Persian Gulf. We've also seen within this vision, which emphasizes integration of both the aid budget, of defense budget, soft power, hard power all together, a pledge to reduce the international aid budget from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP as a temporary measure, given the financial position that lots of countries are finding themselves in the context of COVID. This has been deeply problematic, but it plays to a particular caucus within the Conservative Party that helped to elect Boris Johnson and which dominates his cabinet. But when you look at the integrated view, and a lot of the language in there, it talks about, for example, very positive emphasis on education of girls and so forth, of aid support out there. This is part of the contradiction we've got in here. The aid budget is being reduced. At the same time, so much of the integrated review emphasizes how aid can help prevent war, can help post-war to help to rebuild economies, rebuild countries. It's in Britain's interest to emphasize aid. But we're cutting that because we've got to placate a particular element of the Conservative Party. And what you're seeing in this integrated review is both domestic and international politics coming into competition with one another. You also see within the integrated review and the Defence Command paper, actually very little detail. And one of the things you're seeing very clearly in this is that there's an emphasis about very little detail. The one figure that was put out was the growth of the UK nuclear warheads up to potentially 250 to 260 warheads. And there's been some debate about why this is the case. Why did they say it? They didn't need to publicize that they were doing that. What we have historically seen, and it came under successive governments with David Cameron and so forth, is the UK has declared how many warheads and how many missiles are deployed on its nuclear submarine that's deployed at any one time. Let's see. So it normally says it's 40 warheads and there's 8 missiles. It could carry more. Each missile can carry more warheads. It can carry more missiles. But there has been an announcement this will increase. There seems to be 2 lines of argument why this warhead numbers needs to increase. And it's worth bearing in mind, of the P5 UN members, the UK is the only one with a single delivery system. Unlike France, which has a dyad, the UK has only a single system. So its submarine-launched ballistic missiles have both what might have been seen as a sub-strategic as well as a strategic role. And the 2 reasons are currently put forward, but are not articulated, surprisingly, in this integrated review, because you'd have thought they'd have put some form of justification in for the increase in the warheads, given the emphasis on non-proliferation and so forth. One is, given what we're seeing with the way Russia has been aggressive, both vis-a-vis the Crimea, towards the Baltic states and so forth, and the talks about the Gerasimov doctrine, of a whole series of debates about whether it's, when does war start, when does it finish, what type of doctrine we're dealing with, does NATO need more nuclear options? And when we look at NATO's nuclear forces, it's worth bearing in mind that France is a nuclear power. France returned its conventional forces and reintegrated into NATO's forces, but it did not integrate its nuclear forces. The only 2 countries that have forces declared to NATO in terms of nuclear forces are the United States and the UK. So there's very much emphasis within NATO, as UK is a second centre decision-making, that UK essentially is a backup nuclear guarantor. So one of the arguments about increasing the warhead numbers is to give NATO planners more options. The second argument for increasing the number of warheads and missiles and not declaring how many are ever going to be at sea at any one time is there's concern that with increasing anti-ballistic missile capability, particularly for Russia or possibly with China, that there's concern with only deploying that level of missiles that we currently are, they might not be able to guarantee sufficient assured second strike capability. And therefore there is a need to ratchet up the capability, to have more missiles, to have more and more warheads. But it's an interesting, and I think this is part of the real problem we've got with these documents, that they are, I would almost suggest, strategically illiterate. What they read like is a first draft of an essay, but you need a whole series of other drafts to get that final product out. And one of the problems we've got in these documents is that they are not well written. And if we were seeing them as a military staff paper, we would grade them poorly and say that a lot more work needs to be done. So we're seeing on the nuclear side, I think, signaling that there's concern with Russia, concern to give NATO more options, concern to ensure that the UK has a second strike capability in that respect. If I can move to the next slide. But when we evaluate the document, I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's playing, thank you very much, to multiple audiences. And what we've got here is, if we go back to some of Alison's arguments about bureaucratic politics and organizational process models and things like that, what I think it's worth, when you read the documents, particularly, and they get steadily better. So the integrated review is the worst document, I would suggest. The Defence Command page is a bit better, and the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy is the most coherent of the three documents. Is what we've got is, I think, an amalgam of the things that are Boris's whims, the things that, it's the lily pads he's most interested in. So there's a lot of talks about girls' education. So you see things that are of interest to Boris, that they have greater prominence. We see a battle of within the bureaucracy for have different elements put into the document. So some things are repeated and repeated. And if you were a good editor, and I edit the Journal of International Affairs for Chatham House, I would be going through saying, you've repeated yourself, you don't need to be this long. Why are you repeating yourself? Take some of those bits out. So what you've also got is the bureaucracy between the different departments of state, and even within individual departments of state, some elements are spoken of too often, and some are not mentioned at all. So I think, and there's crass, and there's there's problems in that respect. It needed to be, it's a poor piece of staff work, and I think one of the reasons we've got this, and this is linked to COVID, is I don't think there has been sufficient time put in by government, both the political leadership, but also wider government, into looking at and bringing these documents together, because they've spent so much time and intellectual capital trying to deal with the COVID outbreak. So trying to produce this at the same time as COVID has meant that we've had suboptimal documents produced. We've also seen there's a lot of panderings to the Brexiteer element of the Conservative Party, and particularly Cabinet. So the EU is not mentioned in any respect. It could have been. It's a pointed snub that did not need to be made. But interestingly, if you look at the integrated review document, the words British Army are not mentioned either. So not only if we snub, in a sense, the government snubbed the European Union, it snubbed its own army. So it's interesting how language plays a part here. So we also see, duplication, poor editing. You also see within the documents, and particularly on the defence paper, a whole series of basic errors that should not have been in there. This again reflects really poor staff work. So for example, it might sound really quite small. It talks about the Army's Chinook helicopters. Well, if anybody's a member of the Army or the British Army or the Royal Air Force, they would tell you that those helicopters are run and operated by the Royal Air Force. Now that sounds quite minor. Oh, they got it the wrong service, but it's indicative of a lot of sloppiness in these documents, a lot of errors crap into, which suggests that you haven't had a sense of the A team actually putting this thing together. It suggests very poor staff work, suggests poorly thought through. The language is also interesting, how it's in both documents. There's hints of New Labour. There's hints of Blair's visions of, there's talked about defence diplomacy. There's some of the language of what you would have seen in the 1998 Strategic Defence Review. There's also talk about a dust in technology, and this links back to things like the 2003 for delivering security in a changing world defence reviews. It also harkens back to the defence reviews and the wider Wilson government of the mid-60s, when he talked about the white heat of industrialisation of Britain needed to change its technology change. And there's lots of emphasis on technology here, but I'll let Matt talk about that much more. What is also clear is this government doesn't want to be held to account for anything in the documents. So there is virtually no data on force composition. How many operations can be done simultaneously? Every previous review would tell you how many ships the Royal Navy is going to have, how many armoured regiments, how many battalions. There is all that is just not there. It's striking in its omissions. You get a few little inklings of, we're going to buy 3 new AWACS wedge tails from Boeing, as opposed, we were going to buy 5. But so they've got little hints on odd bits, but you have not got a basic order of battle in there, which you would normally have in a mainstream defence command paper. So it's clear that the government doesn't want to be held to account for anything that it subsequently decides on. It's also got lots of inbuilt contradictions. So there's emphasis on, because of the experience of COVID, we've got to build resilience. So if you were looking at it from a building resilience within the health system, for example, you need to have capacity to expand intensive care units. You need to have surplus, extra capacity in terms of personnel, so you can increase numbers going through. But at the same time, it talks about the emphasis on market forces. So whilst it's talking about resilience, it's not dealing with the whole drive on, particularly from the Brexiteer right wing and the Conservative Party, towards market forces. There's constant inbuilt tensions here. There is no real prioritisation of what must come first and what by the inference should go, apart from the fact we're going to reduce aid. But it doesn't really say, okay, where we're going to prioritise aid, where are we going to prioritise our defence capabilities. The other great element with subtext within all this is concern about the United Kingdom and the state of the Union. You may be aware that Arlene Foster, who leads the Democratic Unionist Party, has just had to resign. There is a local elections in Scotland, local elections across the United Kingdom, but also elections in Scotland to the Scottish Parliament. And there's currently looking like, in the opinion polls, a clear majority wanting an independent Scotland. So what you see in the Defence Command paper, for example, is an emphasis upon what defence means in terms of jobs for Northern Ireland, for Wales and for Scotland. No mention of England, because that's the dominant of the 4 nations. So the emphasis upon how valuable the Union is and how what the Union gets and what each nation of the Union gets from defence and security, and why it would be totally irrational to break up. So it's interesting, within this whole strategic vision about Britain becoming global, there is a concern about the Union. And Boris is one of the most loathed individuals within Scotland, and it's looking increasingly likely that there may well be a push towards a second referendum, or it'll be a third referendum, because the second one is in 2014. So will all this last? This is my final question I'm going to ask us out in this. Well, at the moment, it will probably last in this form as long as Boris lasts. So will that last very long? At the moment, there are a whole series of scandals, questions about corruption and so forth that are hitting Boris. So there's no guarantee that he will last for any length of time, in which case I think a lot of this will start to get unpicked. But who would succeed him within the Conservative Party is not clear at all, particularly will it be somebody who shares similar visions. How far can this go? But as I indicate, there's so much we don't know. So once it starts to see such flesh is put onto the bone, there's talked about expansion of the Royal Navy, but we know 2 of the Navy's surface fleet, but we know 2 of the destroyers and 2 frigates are going to be scrapped early before new ones are acquired. How does this pan out? How does this equate? It's not clear how any of this will work out. So until we get some detail, we're not sure how any of this will actually work. We're also unclear about whether the Union will survive. And if the Union doesn't survive, if Scotland goes for independence, there's question marks about Northern Ireland, particularly because the problem with the Brexit deal that has been struck is that it has separated Northern Ireland economically with a dividing line from the rest of the United Kingdom, which sits very badly with the Unionists. So in a sense, the Unions feel betrayed by the Conservative government on this. So there's no question that the guarantee that the Union itself will survive. And while Britain might talk about a global tilt towards Indo-Pacific, might talk about global Britain, if Scotland goes, if you've got major question marks about the whole preservation of a nuclear capability, you've got a whole question mark about how would you break up armed forces and defense capabilities that have been built as one into more constituent parts. So there's real interesting questions here about obviously survival, interesting question marks about the survival of the Union itself. And if you can think about how long it took to the whole interminable negotiations over Brexit, for good or ill, and how long it took, imagine what they will be if you're trying to get Scotland negotiating with the rest of the United Kingdom to do that sort of separation as well. Because this, in many respects, is even deeper, more personal, more political, and you talk about, the first speaker talked about, from 71, 73 onwards, the union between the two, between England and Wales and Scotland goes back to this, early 18th century. There's lots of issues here. This will completely blow the whole thing apart, potentially, if that breaks up. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dorman. That was a little bit frightening at the end, but it was a very good presentation of the shortcomings of this strategic paper. And I propose to go on with our next speaker, which is Matthew Uttley. And Mr. Uttley, I let you the floor.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Is there any chance you could put my slides, share my slides, please? Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak at this event. Thank you also to the two previous speakers who both covered hugely important ground and situated many of the key issues. I congratulate them both on their PowerPoint skills. Their PowerPoint presentations look much nicer than mine. But I hope what I have to say and what I cover in the slides is something that you find useful. I think we all acknowledge that the integrated review is comparatively new and it takes some time to digest what amounts to hundreds of pages. So please see my intervention as provisional in the sense that there's much more to digest. In the previous presentation, Andrew mentioned the 3 documents that comprise the integrated review. And he mentioned the 3rd document, which relates to defense and security industry strategy. And that's the area that I'm going to be focusing on in my presentation. I should add before I continue that I'm going to try and be as brief as I can, because I've looked reasonably closely at the UK position. But given some of the themes developed already, I very much look forward to hearing French perspectives on some of the issues that have been raised. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so in terms of the presentation I'm going to give, I'm addressing 3 main questions that I hope are of interest. First really relates to questions of continuity and change. So if we look at defense procurement, defense industrial policies, do we see anything new? What do we see as having changed? And what do we see as having remained pretty much as was? Second issue I'm going to reflect on is the extent to which the integrated review changes are attributable to a Brexit effect. And thirdly, I want to look at the potential implications of the UK's new approach in terms of potential future defence procurement and industrial cooperation with the EU member states. So hopefully they're relevant points at the very least. So next slide, please. So let's talk about or think about questions of continuity first. And I think it's fair to say that if we look at the behavior of the United Kingdom, and I dare to say the behavior of France and other states with reasonably developed defense industrial capacity, we see a number of drivers or objectives in government's policies. Essentially, what they're attempting to do, I would argue, is reconcile some foundational questions that are perennial. And quite clearly, the responsibility to protect the state is the primary responsibility of states to defend their sovereignty and security. And on that basis, states intend to assure national sovereignty by equipping their armed services with the best possible defense equipment, ideally state-of-the-art military systems. After all, no country wants to engage in conflict or to try to deter with second-best capability. So clearly a driver of weapons acquisition policy is the need to obtain state-of-the-art military systems. And not surprisingly, we see a direct reference to this as an ongoing theme in the third integrated review paper. Nothing new there. A second dimension is that of ensuring security of supply. In other words, states are typically concerned about acquiring capability, military capability, over which they have limited control. What they fear are dangerous dependencies on foreign suppliers who may interrupt supply or cut off the supply of weapons capabilities. And therefore, states look at ways of ensuring that they preserve a degree of sovereignty in the use of military systems and the ability to upgrade those systems where necessary, where new technologies arise. And as we've seen before in previous reviews, this is evident in the UK's defense defense industry strategy. A third goal of governments perennially is, rhetorically at least, to achieve forms of value for money in their weapon acquisition choices. They need to demonstrate that they're buying the best available technology, hopefully at the lowest possible cost within a requisite development time. And we see reference to this in the UK Defence Review. And finally, there's a preoccupation with avoiding miscalculation in defence expenditure and acquisition. A perennial problem in the United Kingdom is a conspiracy of optimism. When contracting for major defence systems, defence ministries have to make assumptions about the cost of capabilities that they're buying that may not come into service for a decade or 2 decades. And what they want to avoid is that there's a situation where those estimates are incorrect, or where they've underestimated the true costs of major capabilities. And so we see some reference to that as well. So there's, in a sense, these foundational goals could arguably apply to pretty much any developed defence industrial state, and they certainly apply in the UK case. How has the UK sought to reconcile these various drivers traditionally? Well, it's tended to adopt or pursue a broad spectrum approach, relying when it looks to acquire equipment on differing degrees of national or domestic defense industrial activity or participation or supply, and forms of inward technology transfer. So could I have the next slide, please? And so what we see at work is, certainly in the UK case, a series of generic acquisition strategies. And they range from, on the left-hand side, as you see, this notion of self-sufficiency, areas where the UK needs to design, develop, and produce capabilities of its own. A good example of this would be the Queen Elizabeth class carrier program that the UK has undertaken. Moving away from that self-sufficiency model, we see modes of international collaboration where states come together to pool a broadly common requirement and divide the research, development, and production activities, typically amongst the participating states. Another option is that of defense offset, the notion that if the country buys or imports a major defense system from another supplier, then it might look to obtain forms of industrial and financial compensation, insisting on some form of inward foreign direct investment within the national industrial base. And finally, there's the off-the-shelf option, which largely relies on avoiding research and development altogether and simply importing completed systems from a foreign supplier. And if we look at continuities, what we see is that the United Kingdom in its weapons acquisition process is committed to all of these models of acquisition, each with differing implications for the role of national defense industries. So what's changed in UK procurement and in industrial policy? Well, what we see, and perhaps this chimes, whether it coincides with or is related to concepts like Global Britain or not, is unclear. But we see a deliberate enhanced focus on, if you like, moving things towards the left of that spectrum that I showed you, namely sustaining domestic defense industrial capability and expanding it. Now, this could be seen as a relatively significant development because it's always dangerous to characterize the characters of different countries or their approach. But one might perhaps arguably draw a distinction between a kind of neoliberal model of competition and markets that prevails in the United Kingdom and the United States, with more of a statist approach that we might perhaps identify with a country like France. The government might see defense industries as strategic industries or as part of the fabric of the state, rather than in terms of looking outwardly to find or use the global defense market to meet defense equipment needs. So in emphasizing this, if you like, renationalization of defense industrial capacity, we see a significant change, a move away from a UK default, which privileges competitive procurement on international markets and has done since the era of Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s, towards an overt commitment to maintaining onshore UK defense industrial capacity, identifying specific sectors of the onshore defense industrial base on the grounds that by providing contracts with those companies, this will provide degrees of security of supply or supply chain resilience. And thirdly, we see an embracing in the new policy of a wider definition of value for money than we have seen over the last several decades. The default of open competition in United Kingdom defense acquisition policy was based on the market notion that if you can buy equipment more cheaply or more quickly from other suppliers through forms of importation, this was in effect a definition of value for money. We now see a wider definition of value for money in the 2021 paper, which acknowledges that national welfare gains can be accrued when defense expenditure is spent domestically on domestic armaments rather than through forms of import. Now, this is an interesting set of developments and arguably can be attributed in part to a Brexit effect. European Union directives are quite clear that considerations of wider welfare gains from weapons acquisition expenditure for defense expenditure are prohibited. This is seen as something that is anti-competitive. It's all right for states to use a security of supply argument to justify placing contracts domestically, but not the criterion of protecting or developing domestic jobs, skills development, and those sorts of things. So, from perspective of historical precedent, we've seen quite a significant shift here in emphasis. And what we can see there, as I think I've really just intimated, is perhaps the UK government seeing itself, I won't use the word liberated, well, I have done, but in a sense, distancing itself to some degree from the agreements that it was bound by during its period in the European Union. A second dimension of this is the UK's position on international collaboration. Our first speaker spoke very eloquently about the common interests that the UK and France have in collaborating with each other. We use an expression in the UK, you hear it in America as well, it's a no-brainer. There are clear and obvious benefits to be achieved when the United Kingdom and France collaborate with one another, both in terms of operations, operational planning, but also in terms of collaboration on defense systems and defense acquisition, and therefore the associated defense industrial aspects. Now, what we see in the 2021 review is almost a playing down of the prospects of the UK collaborating on an intra-European joint venture basis. And I think we can see this omission as a Brexit effect. What the government is attempting to do here is, if you like, distance itself, at least rhetorically, from collaboration with Europe. So we can see, therefore, I argue, something of a Brexit effect occurring. If I have the next slide, please. Now, what does all of this mean? Is this a change in substance, or is this a change in style? I think the first point to make here, and we shouldn't lose sight of this, is that if we look at the European Union, defense procurement is one of the least regulated areas of state activity. Despite the European Commission's more recent initiatives, acquisition and associated defense industrial policy is essentially largely nationalized within states, but regulated by directives. So one could argue, therefore, that Britain's withdrawal from that system in and of itself hasn't had major implications for either party. Secondly, it seems to me highly likely that when things calm down, and I'll explain what I mean by calm down in a moment, that bilateral UK-France collaboration is likely to continue in the medium to long term. I mentioned a Brexit effect in the UK, and I've argued that in this third review paper, the UK government has been keen to minimise its references to the European states and the European Union, because that would be counter to its Brexit narrative, arguably. So I think that is a rhetorical device rather than an underlying substantive reorientation. And the reason I did say that it would be interesting to get a French perspective is that it's been suggested that the UK has been backing away from collaboration with France, that somehow the relationship in the defence industrial and collaboration sphere has somehow been tarnished by the UK trying to distance itself from France. But we do see, and I think it came through very strongly in the first presentation, that this the Franco-German relationship can be viewed from this side of La Manche, or the Channel, as is it La Manche, forgive my French, pardon. You know, the FCAS system, the UK is accused of sort of walking away from that, the Franco-German alternative. So what we could be seeing, in fact, is a period where there's been a cooling of relations between Britain and France, brought about by a range of things, but with Brexit as the primary catalyst for that. And therefore, given the fact that any reasonable cost-benefit assessment would see collaboration between the UK and France as in the interest of both states in terms of affordability, combined capability, and shared interests. So I think maybe I'm being an optimist, but nevertheless, I think this is a hiccup in the relationship, because there are overwhelming arguments to see that bilateral cooperation between Britain and France, which largely falls outside of EU supranational structures. This is a bilateral relationship, as we know, that we can hope at least that will rekindle. Certainly an issue for the United Kingdom in the context of Brexit is the extent to which the Franco-German post-Brexit, sorry, well, I shouldn't really couch it in Franco-German terms, but maybe the EU's move towards greater coherence and efficiency in developing its defense capability, developing a European defense technological and industrial base. The extent to which Britain's absence from the EU Defence Fund and related initiatives is going to play out in the longer term. And whether or not that might see a shift in activity away from the UK, particularly in terms of defence contractors' investment towards the European Union area, because of the attraction of what can be seen as a significantly increased and bolstered interest and domain of the European Union in seeking to develop R&D, innovation, and so on within the European Union area, of which the EU Defence Fund might be seen as a major development. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I hope it's been of interest to you, and I look forward to some commentary or discussion when the opportunity arises. Merci.
Thank you very much, and merci, Mr. Uttley. It is a good presentation, and I am really happy that you made your first comment. As you said, there are hundreds of pages to read and to analyze. So maybe we have now the French perspective, or the francophone, as Mr. Henrotin is Belgian, and but he knows very well all about French military. So the floor is yours, Mr. Henrotin.
Yeah, I must activate my mic. So thank you, Anthony, and thanks also to invite me to this conference tonight. So first of all, I didn't have any PowerPoint, so you will not have the ability to check my ninja skills in terms of PowerPoint. Second thing, I was afraid to be as critical as Professor Dorman regarding the integrated review, but in fact, I will not be as critical and as well, critical as him. So my presentation tonight will be about two things. First of all, the object of the future British power, and then the subject, so the concretization of this British power. So the object first. When you look at the structure, the very structure of the integrated review, you will see that it's quite very classical regarding all the documents currently in preparation or published in Europe, with scale in terms of risk and threats, which is quite classical. Terrorism first, great power competition with, as Professor Dorman said, first Russia, second the far side of great power competition with China, understand as a systemic competitor, which is not exactly the same. And also, of course, the other questions like pandemics and vulnerabilities and so on. But in the second time, the question also of the projection east of Suez, much more in fact than an Indo-Pacific one. The term itself, of course, is very interesting, as it was said. The term is quoted 34 times around all the documents, which is quite interesting. But in fact, I read that, and it's my opinion, which is not necessarily well informed, but it's my point of view. It's much more return east of Suez, because it's also a question about nationalism and about pride, British pride, regarding its relationship to its relation to the world. So when you look at the documents, the first impression that you can have, and that I had, in fact, is it was the alignment of very fuzzy ambitions. It's more, in fact, Indo-Pacific or east of Suez than global. Very few things about Africa, talk about Europe and so on, but it's quite on the side of the question. There's also the classical question of alliances. Of course, NATO is very important from a global point of view. FPDA is very important regarding the Indo-Pacific point of view. Also, the bilateral alliances, first with the US, second with France, third with Germany, in this specific order, and it have very operational consequences. Also, an ambition very ambitious in this case, the fact to shape the post-COVID order, including in cyberspace, in space, and on the normative, let's call it like that, on the normative international arena, in a context of disintegration of international norms and disintegration of the respect of the international norms. It's very interesting case to see that regarding the question of the projection east of Suez, regarding the question of reshaping the post-COVID order, the near side of the question, European side of the question, is split up. Of course, there's the question of Russia. I understand that the first, as the first potential adversary. But in the second time, that's the question. There's the question of the Mediterranean, for example. And one thing very interesting is to see that the document talked about, I quote the document, significant investment in Cyprus bases. And of course, French terms, we think in terms of relationship to Turkey, the question of Turkish imperialism, and so on. So we are waiting something said about Turkey. There are things said regarding the industrial relationships and notably the relation in aeronautical terms between UK and Turkey. But on the political side and on the strategic side of the British-Turkish equation, there is nothing to say. Nothing was said except from this Cyprus point of view. So, to quote Pink Floyd, there is very high hopes on this integrated review, but what is concretely the concretization? The document itself talked about the investment of 24 billion sterling in 4 years. It's interesting, 24 billions and 6.6 billions for including 6.6 billions to research and development. But in the same time, a lot of debates occurred in the previous years regarding the budget, the financing gap, and the budget gap regarding the investment that were done in Britain. In 2018, we have seen that there was discussion regarding 21 billion budget deficit regarding the investment. Currently, it should be more or less 7 billions, which is quite impressive. 7 billions regarding 80 billions, so excluding the research and development. And so there's a lot of question, of course, regarding the question of the concretization of the capabilities and the ambitions. So now, second part, the question of the subject. And I will take from this point of view, a very French, in this case, a very French perspective regarding military strategy. When you look at what is, concretely, what is the mechanism of military strategy, you've got four dimensions or 4 pillars. Of course, the operational one, the actual use of force, what we call in France stratégie des moyens, the strategy of means, so the technological aspect of building the forces, organizational strategy, how to organize the forces, and last but not least, and maybe the most important in this case, the declaratory strategy, the signaling strategy, how you will market practically your strategy, how you will present it to the world. And so, in fact, when we look at those 4 pillars, which are in fact very intertwined, everything is mashed up practically regarding those pillars. And when we check the defense in a competitive age, what we can see is that, well, in fact, from a declaratory point of view, yes, it's a very signaling strategy. We will go east, we will maintain forces, of course, in photons and so on. We will go global. But in the same time, one of the traps, one of the challenge of the declaratory strategy is to be coherent between what you said and what you are doing. Of course, it's a question of credibility, particularly in a world where, and the integrated strategy told it, in a world where great power competition is also a return implies also return to high intensity operation. So it's not only about talking, it's also about fighting. And so there's the question, of course, of the operational side of the thing. And well, there's a lot of doctrinal works the way in NATO, in the relationship between the US and so on. But the document didn't really talk about military strategy per se. And this is, for me, it's a problem. It's not only about military strategy, it's essentially about the means and about a very detailed, quite detailed list of new capabilities that will be applied. But in fact, when we talk about military strategy, it's not about confusing between the means and the aims. We got the strategic aims. We didn't have the military operational aims. What to do for? To fight and win? To deter? So it's a bit, when I read the document, it's a bit problematic for me. There's a kind of disequilibrium between the different dimensions. The organizational dimension, yes, as Professor Dorman said, effectively how many brigades, battalions, and so on. Once more, talking about means and systems and so on is very interesting, but concretely, it doesn't work if it is not integrated into a clear force structure. So, my opinion, and it's of course subject to further discussion, but my opinion is that if I have to summarize all the documents, so the integrated review, the military part of the military part of the global process of the review, is to do more with less of a bit better stuff. So there's a problem of trying to do a lot more, in fact, with more or less the same stuff, and practically a lot of things that were already announced concretely in the previous year. Just to see how this gymkhana is playing. Just to take the example of the Royal Navy, for example, effectively in the case of the surface fleet, we got 8 Type 26 frigates. Well, it's a frigate, but concretely with regard to the capabilities, it's much more destroyers. After that, 5 Type 31, much more patrol frigates, and now 5 Type 32. So it's very interesting, of course, from the point of view of the naval yards to have 3 different types of ships being constructed at the same time. It's very nice. It's very good, in fact, for the design goals and so on. But it means that for the operational capability of the Royal Navy, in a world where you have to go global, literally, patrolling around Singapore, patrolling into the South China Sea, and so on, it will be difficult to say to the Chinese, for example, well, we are currently present and we are patrolling the South China Sea, and at the same time to have just patrol frigates regarding the current buildup of Chinese naval capabilities. So the risk is that while preparing this and while building those new capabilities, in fact, the risk is to play on the declaratory side of the naval strategy. Say, well, we will have tripwire force. Okay, tripwire is interesting by itself, but when it comes to the kaboom side of the things, does it deliver? It's a good question. Same thing for the deployment of the OPVs, of the patrol ships out of Britain to go to Gibraltar and so on. It's very interesting by itself, but once more, it's much more a signaling strategy than an operational military strategy, because looking at the river class effective military capabilities, it's very limited, 30 millimeter cannon and so on. What's interesting in this case is that at least we have the first studies for the type 83, if I don't make mistakes, type 83 destroyers to replace the type 45, the Darwin class. But once more, it's further into the future. It's at the end of the 2030s. The solid fleet, the solid supply fleet, which is retained, it was an option that was the eviction of this fleet was considered. We have to note that in the same time, the older supply ships, the Fort Rosalie, I think so, will be ousted from the fleet in order to gain some money, and 2 frigates will be lost. So yes, there's a vision to modernize the surface fleet and the supply fleet, of course, which is quite interesting. But once more, a lot of things to do with more or less the same number of hulls. 2 capabilities which are in fact quite interesting and that reflect the opposition between sunrise and sunset technologies, which was, well, very rhetoric, but from a military point of view, quite disturbing, in fact, because every capabilities can, by definition, be useful in a world of great power competition and in a world of high intensity operation. 2 capabilities very interesting by itself. First one, the multi-role ocean surveillance ship. So the ability to protect, even the ability to protect submarine cables, internet cables, energy, and so on, regarding the Russian intrusions and the use and abuse of the Russian drones from the Yantar ships and so on. So the capability to protect, in fact, the electronic sea lines of communications, which is an interesting capability. Once more, it's interesting to see what happens down under the sea, but how to act and how to react practically if well, a Russian drone, maybe a drone from another country is listening to the internet cables, how to react concretely. So it will be interesting to see exactly what this multi-role ocean surveillance ship will look like. Second thing, the littoral strike capabilities and the change with the Royal Marines, the transformation of the Royal Marines from a brigade into a commando force. Interesting, very expeditionary, so very French by its nature. But in the same time, how about using this commando force into higher intensity scenarios? That's the problem. It's always the thing with amphibious forces. You can try to focus on the historical amphibious force of the Royal Navy and having the capabilities to support Norway against Russian actions or things like that. But in the same time, if you want to act, well, in the Gulf of Guinea, for example, you must have something much lighter. So I think that the Royal Navy and the Marines didn't have answered this traditional question of the exact size of the forces. A real question for us, I think so in France, is the question of the Royal Air Force, because France is engaged with the United Kingdom and the United States, something called the Trilateral Strategic Initiative, which allows the 3 air forces work together at a very integrated level. And what we have seen from the recent British decision is the elimination, in fact, of 24 recently modernized Eurofighters. So the current Eurofighter force is 107 aircraft, if I don't make mistakes, plus the question of the F-35, more or less 24, 25 aircraft currently delivered. Currently, there are 48 F-35 that were ordered. The integrated review and the military part of the Defense and the Competitive Age said, well, we will order more F-35, but there are two questions. Is more the 138 aircraft which were initially envisioned as a target for the whole program? And second question, much more important from a TSI perspective and from a trilateral strategic initiative perspective, is the question of the transition from the current block, the Block 3F, from the current force of the F-35 to the Block 4. It's not only a technical question, it's a question of interoperability, and it's also a very costly question because the last numbers that I have is that for every aircraft you will have to pay $22 million to convert the Block 3 into the Block 4, which is quite problematic, of course, because the transition between the two blocks is not only about software, it's also about hardware, with significant modification into the hulls of the aircraft. So there's a question, which is not addressed by the different documents. Other things which is quite problematic, the reduction of advanced detection advanced warning detection aircraft. The initial vision for the wedge tail aircraft was 5 to replace 6 E3 Sentry. So 5 initially and then 3. So maybe there is a risk of radar gap around the northern part of Europe. For us in France, in fact, it's interesting to see that because if the UK didn't assume on the northern part of Europe, France have a risk to be called to do that part of the job. Other things which are quite problematic, no more MQ-9, so the Reapers, protector drones. So a limitation to 16 drones, which is quite good, but in the same time, regarding the different things, the different scenarios, it's quite light. We have the same problem in France, and so it's not only of UK, of course. And last but not least, the reduction of the transport force with the elimination of UK will keep the C-17 and A400M, but will oust the remaining C-100 Hercules. So, of course, when we talk about something global, it's always problematic, of course, to reduce the capability, the supply capabilities offered by air power. Cover this also Tempest. It's a good question. The document said, well, Tempest, future combat air system, is a priority. From a French point of view, we know that those kind of systems are very, very costly. My reading of the situation is that, in fact, the current Tempest / future combat air system is much more a kind of bargaining chip that will offer some leverage in terms of negotiation. The UK wants to discuss with France, Germany, and Spain. We'll see that, but friend advice: take care, guys, because it's very costly. Those kind of capabilities are very, very costly. Last but not least, the British Army. It clearly paid the price of the sunset versus sunrise point of view, with a reduction of the number of main battle tanks from 227 to 147, which will be modernized, which which is quite interesting by itself. But in fact, regarding some scenarios, and specifically the Russian scenario, of course, it has clearly some consequences. One thing very interesting, and I think that we should look much more to that, is the question of artillery. And UK says clearly we need long-range artillery, which is clearly something interesting. Other thing which is interesting is the automated fire support. So it will be very interesting to see how the industry and how Whitehall will manage to produce those kind of systems. Maybe there will be some well, negotiation and some room for cooperation with France with those kind of system. Maybe one last thing that is a bit disturbing for me, and regarding the Royal Navy. Sorry, I skipped the point. Talking about the Royal Navy, is about the anti-ship capabilities of the Royal Navy. Currently, the harpoon capability, the harpoon anti-ship missile, has been discarded. They were too old. There's a program currently on its way with France regarding the future anti-ship missile capabilities, with supersonic missiles and so on. So it's a framework which is now old, 2 or 3 years, I think so, something like that. One thing which is a bit, well, disturbing for me, I spend a big part of my time looking at pictures, photographics, and so on, is the lack on the Type 26 frigates, which will have a clear anti-ship capability, the lack of silver launch system able to launch the missiles. And so one of the questions is that, well, will Britain will turn to the United States to get, well, ALRAs, American missiles, to equip the Royal Navy ship, because we cannot clearly understand the Royal Navy without an anti-ship capability. It's not something that is not something rational. So the Royal Navy will need a capability. So this capability, will it be British and French, or will it be coming from the US? Will it be in the longer run, or will it be only American missiles will be used as stopgap measures? So one in all, in fact, looking at what has been done effectively, I do agree with my predecessors. There are clearly problems with this integrated review. From a military point of view, I see something very declaratory, something very positioned on the vista side of politics, less with operational capability. So what will be the bang for the buck of our British friends in the future is a good question. One good point, nevertheless, to the focus on space, cyberspace, artificial intelligence. As the integrated review mentioned it very clearly and very, not the integrated review, the defense part, and very, with a lot of very relevantly, is the problems in terms of personnel, which touch practically every armies. One of the ways to get out of there is to use robotics, to use artificial intelligence, innovation, and so on. So maybe there's a lot of things to do in common with France regarding those topics as well. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henrotin. I know we'll start the debate, and maybe if there is some remarks for our British guests on the speech of Mr. Henrotin, maybe I can let you the first question, sir. Mr. Uttley, maybe? Yeah. Or maybe Olivier Zajec?
Yes, perhaps if I may, just to complete the very specific, as usual, and very precise analysis of our friend Joseph Henrotin, I'm really impressed, really impressed by what could be called the cultural conversion of British political elites as regarding the industrial strategy. Because I remember well the time 15 years ago when I was writing prospective studies for the French Defense Procurement Agency about, you know, the PPPs. Specialists know about this, the PPPs, the value for money concept, the commercial of the shelf opportunities, and so on. And that was very trendy. That was, you know, in the right sense of history in terms of defense procurement. And now, when we consider this time in retrospect, it is really striking how this landscape totally changed in a way. We are really far from this one-sided perspective now, and especially in the United Kingdom, that is at the center of what was considered as the wise and inescapable future for defense procurement. And so it's not global Britain from this point of view. And that was really clear in the presentation of Professor Uttley. It's not global Britain, it's homemade Britain. In a way that's global operations for and with local jobs. I don't know if it is possible in the years coming, because the weakening of the industrial autonomy in terms of defense in the United Kingdom could appear very profound and very important. So I really wonder about the possibility for London to come back in this dimension, to create jobs, to retain competencies, try to really craft a strategic autonomy of its own in a European context, with cooperations, with a defense procurement articulation with others, and especially with France, but without a complete integration, because with Brexit, obviously, the situation has changed dramatically from this point of view. So I wonder really about the ways and means for Britain to cope with this situation and to create, retain, and credibilize competencies in this area in link with Europe and especially France. So what are the possibilities from the point of view? I was really interested by Joseph's presentation with numbers, with perhaps a critical point of view, but positive critical point of view on the strategy of means from this point of view. So that was my remark. There is, to me, a real cultural shift that is tremendously important for us from the French point of view, but I wonder about the real possibility for the United Kingdom to cope with this and to embody this new culture in a real industrial strategy in the short term.
Yes, Mr. Dorman. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's I think it's a really important point you've all made. But I think what we can trace with this, with Britain's approach to its defence industrial strategy, there's an element of a change in culture within the Conservative Party in recognition that actually defence matters. What we saw in some of the defence industrial strategies from 2012 and before that was it was emphasised on value for money. The market forces buy the cheapest, best piece of equipment wherever it's from, and in many respects, the armed forces supported this. If we can buy it from America, it's best. It was collaborative. It works with Americans. Just buy Americans. What we saw, there was a report written called "A Benefit, Not a Burden" that came out in 2015 during the 2015 general election, which emphasised that actually, that defence investment in spending in defence industries at home actually means money research circulates through. And when you think about value for money, value for money is not just about the final price, but it's actually about how much money is retained within the state itself. And that points that actually, if you're employing people at home and so forth, that's a much wider point here. You can actually have a real value here. And what we'd seen up to by 2015 and a couple of years since then is how much the UK was importing. It's become one of the largest defence importers over the last few years. And what we're seeing in these white papers, what we've seen that had already started under Cameron, but also at May, is a recognition that you could start to influence the industrial dimension and industrial lands of the United Kingdom by investing in defence. And if you think back for the election which we recently had, in which Boris Johnson managed to gain a whole series of seats that had traditionally been Labour seats and Liberal Democrat seats. So it was in southwest of England, in northwest of England, and so forth. And what Johnson has been quite open about is actually what we can see with the defence industrial base is a way of solidifying and redistributing wealth within the country and as a way of generating industrial jobs, high-tech skill jobs, and so forth. And you see in all three papers an emphasis on this defence industrial dimension as a way of reinvigorating Britain's manufacturing base. So you've got a lot of emphasis placed upon this, saying it was not just about which of the three, what jobs were in Scotland, which jobs were in Wales and Northern Ireland, but also some emphasis upon jobs in Northwest and so forth, and different elements, whether it be space construction and so forth, were about jobs at home. So you've got this real status dimension, which is quite anti-Thatcherite in many respects, coming in within the government. It is very much emphasises market forces, very much emphasises trying to reduce the size of the state. Yet Johnson himself has become quite a statist prime minister. And so you've got this, one of the many contradictions we're seeing at the moment is this is a way of trying to increase jobs, but more importantly from the government's point of view, preserve those Conservative seats that it's recently gained. So it's about jobs at home. So, this is why it's become so important. It's a way of regenerating manufacturing jobs at home rather than employing people in America and so forth. One of the previous defence ministers, Gavin Williamson, went into the States, and I can't remember which state in the United States he was in. He talked about how many US defence jobs were supported by Britain's defence purchases. And I think it was 150,000. It was enormous numbers. So I'm thinking, the government started going, but they could be at the UK. Why are we employing other people to build our equipment and so forth? We could do it at home. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree entirely with Andrew's analysis. The other factor that you could add in there is the post-2015 national security objectives, which remain in place, and a great desire to demonstrate the fact that the investment that the country makes in defence creates prosperity. The prosperity gains from defence expenditure could be considered as direct and indirect. And the direct effect is through, for example, the use of the armed forces to keep sea lines of communication open through which trade can transit. In other words, the direct economic benefits are using the armed services either passively or actively in order to create an environment that creates prosperity for the United Kingdom. The indirect effects of defense expenditure are in areas like defense acquisition and defense industrial activity. And the difficulty that the UK has had is in quantifying those primary economic benefits. The secondary benefits are relatively easy to capture. You know where the money goes, you know what the money's spent on, you know how many jobs are created, how many scientists and apprentices and so on and so forth. You know that arms exports generate revenues that come back to the French or the British exchequer. The tricky thing is to calculate those direct economic returns. But the point substantively I was trying to make is that you've got, as one of the three national security objectives, this idea of prosperity. And that, I think, provides the macro justification for thinking about direct and indirect economic gains associated with defense expenditure. Clearly, if we wind the clock back a few years, we'll say to 2015, it would be inconceivable that a Conservative administration would be introducing statist intervention. The government refused to have lists of capabilities that had to be British, pretty much. And they were wedded to the idea of competition by default, which essentially often meant importing from the United States. So this is really quite a tectonic shift in the position taken by a Conservative government. So we do live in interesting times. This is quite a significant development. Now, I do think, going back to what was talked about earlier, there is a kind of Brexit dimension here, because I'm speaking, very anecdotally, but the British position on the EU has always been, or the narrative that it tells itself, is that the EU creates rules. The British are very good at obeying rules. They introduce rules and they adhere to those rules. And the problem is that, not all EU member states behave in such a way. That may be completely wrong empirically. It could be a complete myth, but it's a myth that is a truth, if you like, in the kind of narrative about the implementation of EU regulations. I'm not qualified to comment on this. I'm sure it might be considered quite insulting, actually, but there is an aspect here, and therefore the UK obviously played a significant role in framing these defence directives as a major European partner, but in certain respects, it was constrained by the rules it created. And part of what we're seeing looks like an overt deviation from those directives that until recently it had been required to follow. And the most, I guess, one of the most controversial aspects relate to defense offset, where a country decides to procure a ship or an aeroplane from another country, and it insists on the supplying country or firm to place jobs and factories and so on within the domestic economy. And offsets were banned under the directives that relate to procurement. And in a sense, much of that industrial strategy document is hinting at not overtly breaking the rules, but having an unwritten law that says, or rule that says, if you want to obtain orders in the United Kingdom, you have to become part of the onshore defence industrial base, which is effectively an unwritten form of offset policy. But sorry, I perhaps dominated the discussion for too long there, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Océane Tranchet.
Yes, thank you very much for all you very interesting and articulated presentations. I would have like dozens of questions, but one in particular is running into my mind. Professor Dorman, the end of your presentation was kind of scary. And I was wondering if the government is as concerned, as you say, about the state of the Union and the possibility of Scotland leaving the UK. Why would they mention the rise of a nuclear warhead at all in their document, if not beside from the sloppiness you mentioned? Isn't it dangerous? And why is there a political reason for them to do that? I would like to have your opinion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I haven't got an official answer to that, so my answer is slightly speculative. It is very odd that they announced they were increasing the number of warheads. They didn't need to do that. They could have done it quite quietly. The problem I think we've had is that preceding governments have kept announcing how many warheads they've reduced by and what they've reduced to. They could have quite quietly just said they're not going to publish what the warheads and missiles being deployed are going to be. I think because they've said it, I think it's an overt signal, and it cannot be about the Union, because as you rightly put, to emphasise an increase in warheads is to play to those who want within Scotland who want to leave the Union, because we know that there's a vast majority within Scotland who are very anti-nuclear. They would prefer not that the nuclear capability is retained in Scotland. So my speculative answer would be that I think it has to be to do with signalling both by the United Kingdom as a United Kingdom, but also the United Kingdom as part of NATO towards Russia. But I have not got evidence to confirm that.
Thank you.
If I may have a remark on that, maybe a nuclear doctrine is also articulated with a conventional doctrine and capabilities. So maybe by increasing nuclear capabilities, they intend to liberate some means and some capabilities to put them somewhere else, maybe east of Suez, namely. What do you? Is that credible, or is it? Could it be a justification of increasing nuclear capabilities?
I don't think so. I mean, it could be. I mean, as I've indicated, I'm speculating why they. It was such an odd thing, given the paucity, the lack of information on numbers across the board on conventional forces and so forth, that to suddenly announce and quite openly announce, and they haven't explained. There's been no narrative to explain why they're going to significantly increase the number of warheads. Given that historically we know that the nuclear capability has been primarily focused around, although since 1994 there's no, officially the British nuclear deterrent is not focused at anybody and it's not pointed at anybody. But historically we know, for the reason for its original creation was about fear about the Soviet Union, a way of deterring the Soviet Union and aggression from the East. The logical implication within all this is it's about Russia. And the two things, scenarios, I think why they would increase numbers would be, one, to have a greater variety of warheads at sea at any one time to give NATO an option in terms of how it responds to various asymmetric type conflicts or from Russia, to deal with this, its hybrid warfare, however we want to frame it. And we've seen that Russia is very much emphasised its what's referred to as sub-strategic forces and its more localised forces. The other is basically when it had reduced its force at sea to 8 missiles with 40 warheads, that's insufficient to achieve sufficient assured second strike capability with improvements to the Russian air defense capabilities, particularly against ballistic missiles. And therefore they needed to increase the number of both missiles and warheads as a way of guaranteeing a minimum second strike capability to maintain deterrence. Those are the two things would seem to me the logical reasons for making that announcement. And you therefore, in doing that, by saying you're making the increase, you are also sending that signal to Russia. Yeah. But as I said, I have got nobody or will go on the record or off the record to guarantee to confirm that yes or not.
Okay. And could it be smaller yields because
that's what I think. Yeah, I think one of the things might be with the NATO is you might be seeing instead of 8 missiles each with 5 warheads, you might have a variety with some with more warheads, some with less warheads, possibly some with smaller warheads, as part of that, giving NATO nuclear planners greater options. Yeah,
so Olivier, it's very interesting in the return of nuclear tactical nuclear. Maybe it's something we are discussing for.
And it's also and again. You're right, and go within that, there's been talk about cross-domain. So whether would a sufficient, for example, cyber attack lead to a nuclear response or not? And there's been speculation on that one as well. It's now talking about cross-domain deterrence.
Thank you very much. Is there any question from the assistants and from people who are listening to us? I see that there is still a lot of people outside of us.
I would add, if I may, a bit something regarding the question of the implementation of the number of warheads. It's also a way to secure the procurement and the construction of the Dreadnought class. The Dreadnought submarine launch. Yes, the Dreadnought will replace, in fact, the V-class submarines. It costs a lot, so you must have something to say to the public opinion also to secure the procurement and to secure the cooperation with the United States in this case. So maybe there's also something on top of what was said. Something to add like that.
I think you're right. There is a defence industrial dimension to it, which I should have also, but I don't think it's that defence industrial. It's not about the actual submarine construction. I think what we're seeing at the moment, there's a debate, and I cannot remember what I think it's Mark 93. I'm trying to remember. The US are developing a new program to effectively change the warhead design to fit on the existing Trident ballistic missiles and their subsequent replacement missile, which the UK is linked into. And I think Congress has been debating whether to cut that program or not. And one of the arguments for also increasing the British nuclear arsenal is to say if we increase our share of that overall order to support the design of the new warhead. So it's part of in getting the Americans to go ahead with the program for a new design. We ourselves can go ahead with a program for new design. So you've got this argument that it's actually partly about trying to influence congressional decision making rather than home decision making.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Uttley, you wanted to add something, I guess? No.
Perhaps just one word.
Yeah.
I really regret that we have not this evening with us a representative of Dassault Aviation, because in a way, Dassault is for now the best advocate of a real industrial cooperation with the United Kingdom, not only in the fighter jet dimension. So it's really interesting. That's the most national independence-oriented industrial actor in France. That is the best advocate of industrial cooperation with with the United Kingdom, and they have a lot of arguments for this. That points to me to a very interesting fact. Inside the EU, France doesn't want to be alone with Germany. Outside the EU, the United Kingdom doesn't want to be alone with itself. So, well, there's a room for cooperation apart from all the strategic cultural differences we have. And that's perhaps a chance for the British government, this situation, this triangulation in Europe. So I think that this subject is far from being closed. The integrated review is a little bit disappointing. I would say that, but that's only the beginning of the story. And I bet that in the month coming, we should see a lot of interesting moves and perhaps games between Paris, London, and Berlin. And that would be interesting to analyze. And I hope that we perhaps can share and views again about the subject.
So thank you, Olivier. I think it's time to free Mr. Dorman. We have already exceeded the time he gave us. So it's for me a pleasure to thank all the speakers tonight, Mr. Uttley, Mr. Dorman. Thank you very much for participating to this great debate. I see we could have talk 1 hour more, or maybe more. And I also thank Mr. Henrotin and of course Olivier Zajec for their presentation. See you soon for some more conferences and so for our online events with the IESD. Thank you very much and good evening to all. Goodbye.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much.